May 12, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 4 days, but at a converted Luftwaffe base near Fulda, Germany, men were still dying. Not from bullets or bombs, but from food. 1,200 Soviet prisoners, liberated from German labor camps and factories, arrived in American custody so malnourished, their uniforms hung like canvas sacks on coat hangers. The U.S. Army had warehouses overflowing with rations, 3 field kitchens capable of feeding a regiment, and orders to process these men in 72 hours. But when Lieutenant Frank Merritt watched 23 prisoners collapse after their first hot meal, he faced an impossible choice: follow doctrine and kill them with kindness, or violate protocol and let the food rot while men starved. The abundance could be as lethal as the camps they'd escaped. The trucks arrived in columns throughout the morning, GMC CCKW cargo carriers grinding through mud-rutted roads that still showed German military markings. Lieutenant Frank Merritt stood at the processing gate, clipboard in hand, watching the first group dismount. They moved like marionettes with half their strings cut, feet shuffling, heads down, bodies that had forgotten how to carry their own weight. He was 29, trained in physiology at Johns Hopkins before the war pulled him into Army Medical Corps. 2 years of field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhine had shown him every variation of human damage: shrapnel wounds, burns, frostbite, typhus. But this was different. These weren't battle casualties. They were what happened when a body consumed itself to stay alive. The Soviet prisoners came in 3 categories, according to the hasty classification system Command had distributed. Category 1, ambulatory, capable of self-care. Category 2, weakened but stable. Category 3, critical, requiring immediate hospitalization. Merritt's initial assessment put 60% in Category 2, 30% in 1, and the rest teetering on the edge of 3. They wore remnants of Red Army uniforms, most so patched and faded they were barely identifiable. Lice moved visibly in the seams. Many had improvised footwear, wooden clogs or rags wrapped around feet that showed evidence of frostbite from the previous winter. Their eyes held a particular emptiness that Merritt had learned to recognize. Not fear, not even pain, just the flat absence of expectation. Captain Walter Baines, the supply officer, met him near the gate. Baines was 42, a logistics man from Michigan who'd spent the war making sure the right equipment reached the right place at the right time. He viewed efficiency as a moral virtue. "We're set up for 400 per meal rotation," Baines said, consulting his own clipboard. 3 rotations daily: beef stew, white bread, coffee with sugar. "We've got enough in depot to feed twice this number for a month." Merritt nodded slowly. "What's the calorie count per serving?" 2,800, give or take. Standard GI ration scale. "These men haven't eaten 2,800 calories in 6 months combined." Baines frowned. "Doc, we've got orders. Feed them, get them healthy enough to transport. The Soviets want them back, and we're not running a rest camp here." Through the gate, more prisoners were being directed toward delousing stations. Merritt watched one man stumble, catch himself on another's shoulder, then continue walking as if nothing had happened. The body's last reserves burning out. "I need to set up medical screening first," Merritt said. "Weight, blood pressure, signs of edema. We feed them wrong, we'll kill them." Baines looked at him like he'd suggested flying the prisoners to the moon. "Kill them with food? Doc, have you seen these people? They're starving." Which is exactly why we can't just fill their plates and walk away. But Baines was already moving toward the supply depot, calling out orders to his sergeants. The field kitchens were firing up, M1937 stoves that could boil enough water to make coffee for a battalion. The smell of cooking beef began to drift across the compound, rich and heavy in the cold spring air. Merritt made a note on his clipboard. Then he went to find an interpreter. The first meal was scheduled for 1400 hours. 3 mess tents had been erected in the center of the compound, long tables with benches, the kind of setup that could process hundreds of men efficiently. Merritt stood near the serving line, watching the prisoners file in. They moved in silence. No talking, no pushing, no rush toward the food. Just a quiet, orderly advance that felt wrong. Soldiers were supposed to complain about chow, joke with each other, act human. These men moved like they were walking towards something they didn't quite believe existed. The serving crew, American GIs from the 83rd Support Battalion, ladled out portions with the automatic efficiency of men who'd done this 1,000 times. Stew thick with beef and vegetables, 2 slices of white bread, a tin cup of coffee, steam rising in the cool air. The first prisoner to receive a full plate stopped. Just stopped, holding the tray, staring down at the food like it was a diagram in a foreign language. The man behind him stopped too, then the next. Within 30 seconds, the entire line had come to a halt. "Keep moving," one of the servers called out, gesturing. But no one moved. Merritt stepped closer. Through an interpreter, a Polish sergeant named Kowalski, who spoke passable Russian, he asked what was wrong. The nearest prisoner, a man with a scarred face and sergeant's shoulder boards still barely visible on his tunic, looked at Merritt directly for the first time. "This is for us?" "Yes, all of it. Eat." The sergeant laughed. It was a dry, bitter sound. "No, this is a trick." "It's not a trick. It's food. You're in American custody now. We feed prisoners. Americans feed Germans. We are Russians. Russians who surrendered." He said the word like a curse. "We are traitors. You will send us back to NKVD. This," he gestured at the plate, "this is to make us soft first, to laugh at us." Kowalski translated quickly. Merritt felt something cold settle in his stomach. He hadn't considered this, that the prisoners would see abundance as mockery. That kindness would look like cruelty through the lens of what they'd survived. "Tell them it's real," Merritt said. "Tell them they can eat. They're safe here." Kowalski did. Some of the prisoners sat down. Most continued standing, holding trays, uncertain. The few actually set the food down and walked away, returning to their barracks tents empty-handed. Merritt watched maybe 30% actually eat. They did so slowly, mechanically, eyes watching the servers and guards as if expecting the food to be snatched away. He made notes, started timing how long each man took to finish, started watching for physical reactions. The reactions came faster than he'd feared. At 15:45 hours, 45 minutes after the meal began, a prisoner near the back of the tent stood up suddenly, swayed, and vomited. Before medics could reach him, he collapsed. By 1600, 3 more had gone down. By 1630, the aid station had 15 cases. By nightfall, 23 men were in critical condition. Merritt worked through the evening, checking vital signs, administering glucose, trying to stabilize men whose bodies were essentially drowning in nutrients they couldn't process. The medical term was refeeding syndrome. When a severely malnourished body suddenly received rich food, it triggered metabolic chaos. Phosphate levels crashed. Heart rhythms went haywire. Organs shut down. He'd read about it in medical journals, a footnote in studies on famine. Now he was watching it happen in real time. At 2200 hours, he sent a radio message to the medical section in Wiesbaden using the SCR 510, described the situation, requested immediate protocol guidance. The response came back terse. Reduce portions. Supplement with glucose solution. Prioritize evacuation of critical cases. Reduce portions. With a supply depot holding enough food to feed a division, the official medical guidance was to let men stay hungry. He looked at the numbers again. 23 collapsed. Out of maybe 350 who'd actually eaten. Nearly 7% casualty rate. From soup and bread. Captain Baines found him in the aid tent past midnight. "What the hell happened, Doc? We feed them and they drop?" "Their bodies can't handle it. Severe malnutrition changes metabolism. You shock the system with rich food, it can kill them faster than starvation." "So what do you want me to do? Let the food rot?" Merritt was too tired to be diplomatic. "I want you to let me control the portions. Thin soups, limited bread, gradual increase over 4 days, not 4 hours." That's not what Command ordered. Command didn't see 23 men collapse because we followed orders. Baines left without answering. But the next morning, when Merritt posted new feeding protocols, no one countermanded them. The real fight was just beginning. Frank Merritt had grown up in Providence, Rhode Island, in a house where dinner conversation consisted of his father, a surgeon, describing procedures in clinical detail while his mother, a nurse, corrected his anatomical terminology. He'd learned to think of the human body as a machine, elegant but mechanical, governed by chemistry and physics. Medical school reinforced that view. At Johns Hopkins, he'd specialized in metabolic disorders, studying how the body processed nutrients, what happened when systems failed. He'd written his thesis on protein metabolism in prolonged starvation, using data from famine studies in India and China. It was academic work, graphs and tables, intellectual exercise. Then he joined the Army and discovered that all those graphs represented people. His first field hospital in France had taught him to work fast, prioritize, accept that not everyone could be saved. His second, near the Belgian border, had taught him that cold was as dangerous as bullets. By the time he reached Germany, he'd learned to spot typhus, diagnose trench foot by smell, and estimate blood loss from the color of a man's lips. But nothing had prepared him for the prisoners. Not German POWs, who were generally well-fed enough. The Soviet prisoners who'd been held by the Germans, worked in factories and camps, kept alive only because dead slaves produced nothing. They arrived with bodies that had cannibalized themselves, muscles atrophied, organs running on fumes. And Command expected him to reverse months of starvation in 72 hours. He understood the pressure. The Soviets wanted their people back. The Americans wanted to clear camps, redeploy personnel, shut down the occupation apparatus. Every prisoner who stayed in U.S. custody was a logistics burden and a diplomatic headache. But Merritt had taken an oath, do no harm. And right now, the harm was coming from well-intentioned abundance. He spent the morning of May 13th implementing new protocols. Each tent would receive 50 liters of thin barley soup, 20 loaves of bread divided among the occupants. No seconds until day 3. Water freely available. Each prisoner would be weighed and issued a numbered wooden token for food distribution. Sergeant Paul Denny, who ran compound security, helped organize the system. Denny was a practical man from Iowa, 35 years old, who'd spent most of the war managing supply depots. He understood inventory control and viewed the prisoners with the same pragmatic efficiency he'd applied to managing ammunition stocks. "You really think they'll riot if we don't give them enough?" Denny asked, watching prisoners line up for the noon distribution. "I think they'll die if we give them too much." "Weird war," Denny muttered. The distribution went smoothly. Merritt had printed simple instruction sheets, translated by Kowalski into Russian, explaining the portions. Most prisoners accepted the bowls without complaint. A few looked confused, even disappointed. One man handed his bowl back, shaking his head. "He says it's an insult," Kowalski translated. "Says you feed dogs better." Merritt kept his voice level. "Tell him I'm keeping him alive. Tell him in 4 days he can have more. But today, this is what saves him." The message was relayed. The prisoner took his bowl, but didn't look convinced. By evening, only 2 men had shown symptoms of metabolic distress, both mild. The aid station handled it easily. Merritt logged the results, noted the improvement, and prepared his evening report. That's when Major Alexander Zorin arrived. The Soviet repatriation mission announced itself with 3 trucks and a staff car bearing Red Army markings. Major Zorin emerged wearing a uniform so new it still held creases from the quartermaster's packing. He was perhaps 40, lean and hard-faced, with eyes that assessed everything and warmed to nothing. The meeting took place in what had been the Luftwaffe base commander's office, now repurposed for American administration. Merritt attended alongside Captain Baines and the camp commandant, Colonel Hendricks, a weary 50-year-old who'd been managing displaced persons since the Rhine crossing. Zorin spoke through his own interpreter, though Merritt suspected he understood English better than he let on. "I am here to assess readiness for repatriation. Soviet citizens must return to the motherland. We have transport arriving in 10 days. All prisoners will be prepared for transfer." 10 days. Hendricks repeated. "Major, these men are in poor condition. We're implementing a medical rehabilitation program. They are soldiers of the Red Army. They will be ready." Merritt leaned forward. "Major, with respect, these men are severely malnourished. Their bodies have been in starvation mode for months. We can't rush the recovery process without risking—" "Soldiers of the Red Army do not die from soup," Zorin interrupted. His tone allowed no argument. "Your concern is noted, but the Soviet Union determines the fate of Soviet citizens. Your role is to provide basic care until transfer." "Basic care includes not killing them," Merritt said quietly. The room went silent. Zorin's interpreter hesitated before translating. The major's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "The motherland will care for her sons," Zorin said. "You will prepare them for transport. 10 days." After the Soviets left, Hendricks rubbed his face with both hands. "Doc, I need you to work a miracle here. Get them stable enough to move, but don't antagonize the Russians. Last thing we need is an international incident over soup portions. Sir, I need at least 14 days to implement a proper refeeding protocol. You have 10. Make it work." Merritt returned to his quarters, a converted barracks room with a desk and field telephone. He pulled out medical texts he'd brought from the States, journals on nutrition, notes from his thesis. Somewhere in the data was a way to compress the timeline without compromising safety. The math was brutal. Normal refeeding protocols called for incremental increases of 200 to 300 calories daily, starting from a base of 1,000 to 1,200. At that rate, reaching maintenance levels took 3 weeks. He needed to do it in 10 days without triggering metabolic collapse. He started calculating protein ratios, lipid balance, micronutrient supplementation. By 3,000, he had a framework. High carbohydrate soups for immediate energy, small amounts of protein to prevent muscle wasting, thiamine supplements to prevent cardiac complications, increase calories by 400 daily, monitoring for edema and arrhythmia. It was aggressive, risky, but it might work. At 0630, he presented the plan to Baines. The supply officer listened, made notes, and said, "I'll need to source thiamine supplements, milk powder, different soup bases. Can't do it with what's in depot. How fast can you get it? 48 hours if I pull some strings. Pull them. Baines actually smiled. Nice to see supply finally being used right, Doc. The cultural misunderstanding deepened before it improved. On the third day, Merritt noticed something odd. Prisoners were returning significant portions of their meals, not because they couldn't eat, but deliberately. Setting aside half a bowl, wrapping bread in cloth, hiding it under bunks. Through Kowalski, he learned why. Rumors had spread through the barracks. The generous Americans were fattening them up for punishment. In the Soviet system, prisoners who cooperated too much with captors were branded traitors. Some believed that eating well would be seen as evidence of collaboration, used against them when NKVD interrogators asked questions after repatriation. They think if they arrive fat, they'll be shot, Kowalski explained. Better to stay thin, prove they resisted. Merritt felt something break inside him. These men were afraid to eat, not because food was scarce, but because survival itself was suspicious. He asked Kowalski to arrange a meeting with prisoner representatives. 6 men came, including the sergeant with the scarred face from the first day. They stood in the medical tent, tense and uncertain. "I want to explain something," Merritt began. Kowalski translated as he spoke. "We're not fattening you up. We're keeping you alive. The food isn't a trick. It's not a test. You got sick because your bodies couldn't handle rich food after starvation. That's why we're going slowly," the scarred sergeant spoke. "You send us back to Stalin. He will ask why we did not die fighting, why we let Germans capture us. There is no good answer to these questions. I can't control what happens after you leave here. But while you're in American custody, my job is to keep you alive and healthy. That's all. No tricks, no traps." "Then why do you care? We are nothing to you." Merritt didn't have a good answer for that. After a long pause, he said, "Because I'm a doctor. It's what I do." The sergeant studied him. "In Red Army, doctors serve the state. Who do you serve?" "All right, the person in front of me." Something shifted in the room. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the possibility of trust. The sergeant spoke again. Kowalski translated. "If we eat more, will you give us more?" "Yes, as much as your bodies can safely handle. Every day, a little more." The sergeant nodded slowly. The meeting ended without resolution, but that evening, fewer meals came back uneaten. By May 15th, the modified protocol was showing results. Average weight gain per prisoner was 1.8 kilograms. Cases of edema had dropped from 14% to 3%. No new collapses. Merritt's reports to Wiesbaden documented the improvement, but he knew numbers weren't the whole story. The real change was behavioral. Prisoners began to line up earlier for meals. They stayed at tables longer, eating slowly. Some started attempting conversation with the American servers, using hand gestures and broken German or Polish. Denny reported that work details, prisoners volunteering to help with camp maintenance, were becoming more common. But external pressures were mounting. German civilians, recruited for auxiliary labor, began complaining. The civilians were still on strict rations, barely enough to survive. Seeing warehouses full of American supplies going to Soviet prisoners stirred resentment. A delegation of local officials met with Colonel Hendricks. Merritt sat in on the meeting, taking notes. The Burgomaster, a thin man in his 60s named Schneider, spoke carefully. "We understand the humanitarian necessity. But our people are hungry too. When they see prisoners eating better than German children." "Are you suggesting we reduce rations for prisoners?" Hendricks asked. "Perhaps the excess food could be shared with local population. These are liberated prisoners of war, not refugees. different jurisdiction entirely. To a hungry child, the distinction means nothing. Hendricks promised to forward the concerns to higher command. Merritt knew nothing would come of it. The German population was not the army's priority. Still, he ordered that food waste be incinerated rather than discarded, to avoid visible proof of abundance. The decision backfired. Within days, counterintelligence received reports that Americans were deliberately destroying food while Germans starved. An investigation was launched. 2 CIC agents arrived, questioned staff, inspected the kitchens, reviewed disposal logs. Their final report cleared Merritt and the camp administration, but recommended improved communication with local authorities to manage expectations. In practice, this meant regular meetings where Hendricks explained that feeding POWs was not negotiable, and local officials nodded without believing him. The incident illustrated a deeper truth. In a continent devastated by war, every calorie was political. Food wasn't just nutrition. It was power, diplomacy, justice, revenge. The decision of who ate and who went hungry carried moral weight that transcended any individual camp or program. Merritt tried to stay focused on the medical mission, but he understood now that nothing happened in isolation. Every meal he served was part of a larger equation he couldn't control. The turning point came on May 18th during the evening meal. Merritt was making his rounds, checking prisoners for signs of distress, when Sergeant Denny approached him. "Doc, you need to see this." In the second mess tent, a prisoner was standing at the serving line after finishing his meal. He was holding his empty bowl, gesturing to the server. The American GI looked confused, unsure what the prisoner wanted. Kowalski hurried over, translated, then turned to Merritt, almost smiling. "He's asking for seconds." The prisoner was the scarred sergeant from the earlier meetings. He stood there calmly, bowl extended, waiting, not demanding, not desperate, just asking. Merritt nodded to the server. "Give him more." A ladle of soup filled the bowl. The sergeant took it, sat down, and ate slowly, methodically. When he finished, he set the bowl down, stood, and walked to the exit without looking back. But others had noticed. By the next morning's meal, a dozen prisoners asked for seconds. By noon, 30. Merritt authorized increased portions for anyone who could tolerate them, monitoring carefully for adverse reactions. The psychological barrier had broken. The prisoners weren't just accepting food. They were claiming it. The act of asking for more, of believing they could have more, was revolutionary for men who'd learned that survival meant invisibility. Denny noticed it too. "They're different," he told Merritt. "More present. Like they're remembering they're human." Merritt noted it in his daily report. Voluntary return for additional portions indicates psychological recovery beyond physical. Prisoners now exhibit agency regarding nutrition rather than passive acceptance or refusal. Recommend continued incremental increases based on individual tolerance. When Major Zorin returned for his second inspection, the change was visible. The prisoners stood straighter, made eye contact. Their uniforms, though still worn, were cleaner. They'd organized their barracks, established run. Zorin walked through the compound with Hendricks and Merritt. He said little, observed everything. At the end, he summoned his interpreter and spoke formally. "Conditions here exceed minimum standards. The men are prepared for transport. We will proceed with repatriation as scheduled." It wasn't praise, but from Zorin, it was acknowledgement. After the Soviets left, Hendricks clapped Merritt on the shoulder. "You did good, Doc. Got them healthy enough to ship out without starting World War III over soup portions." Merritt didn't feel victorious. He knew what repatriation meant. Most of these men would face interrogation. Some would be imprisoned. A few might be executed. The NKVD didn't forgive surrender easily. But that was beyond his control. His job had been to keep them alive and stable long enough to choose their own fate, or at least to be healthy enough to face whatever fate awaited them. That night, he wrote in his personal journal, "We fed them. They trusted us. Now we send them back to Stalin." I'm not sure which was the greater kindness. The repatriation began on May 20th. GMC trucks arrived at dawn, engines idling, exhaust visible in the cold morning air. The prisoners assembled in the compound, belongings in improvised bags, expressions carefully neutral. The boarding process was orderly. Names checked against lists. Each man received a paper documenting his time in American custody, though no one believed the papers would matter to Soviet authorities. As they climbed into trucks, some looked back at the camp, others stared straight ahead. Sergeant Denny stood near the gate, watching. "You think they'll be okay, Doc?" "I think they'll be alive. Beyond that," Merritt shrugged, "not our call." The scarred sergeant was among the last to board. As he passed Merritt, he stopped, said something in Russian. Kowalski translated. He says, "Thank you for the seconds." Then he climbed into the truck and was gone. Over 3 days, 1,147 prisoners were repatriated. 26 remained hospitalized with conditions requiring additional stabilization. 27 were unaccounted for, having slipped away during the confusion of processing. Merritt suspected they'd chosen to disappear rather than face Soviet interrogation. He didn't report it. With the camp emptying, he focused on documentation. His medical logs had become extensive. Weight charts, caloric intake records, incident reports, recovery timelines. He compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Nutritional rehabilitation of severely malnourished prisoners, field observations and protocols. The report was thorough, clinical, deliberately impersonal. It described refeeding syndrome in detail, documented the effectiveness of gradual caloric increase, and recommended specific protocols for future operations. He included appendices, sample meal plans, thiamine dosing schedules, monitoring checklists. He sent it through proper channels to the Division Medical Command in Frankfurt, with copies to the Surgeon General's office. Then he waited. The response came 3 weeks later. His protocols would be incorporated into a new technical manual, Feeding and Rehabilitation of Prisoners of War, ETO 1945. All medical units handling liberated prisoners would receive training on refeeding syndrome and gradual nutrition restoration. It was a quiet victory. No commendations, no recognition beyond a brief note in his personnel file. But Merritt knew the value. The next group of starving prisoners would have a better chance because his team had learned the hard way. Captain Baines stopped by before shipping out to his next assignment. "Heard your reports going into the manual. Congratulations, Doc. It's just data. Data that'll save lives. That's more than most of us can say." Baines paused. "You know what got me? You were right about the waste. We almost killed them by being generous. Who expects that? Anyone who understands starvation. Most of us don't. That's why we needed you." After Baines left, Merritt walked through the empty camp. The mess tents were gone. The barracks stood silent. The field kitchens had been packed up and shipped to the next location. In a few weeks, this would just be an abandoned Luftwaffe base again, waiting to be repurposed or demolished. He thought about the scarred sergeant, the 23 men who'd collapsed from kindness, the hundreds who'd learned, slowly, that they could ask for more without punishment. The camp at Fulda had been operational for exactly 3 weeks. In that time, It had become a laboratory of accidental ethics. Every decision had carried weight beyond medicine. How you fed people wasn't just about calories. It was about dignity, trust, power, and the complicated mathematics of compassion. Merit had done his job, kept them alive, sent them back, documented what worked. It wasn't heroic, it was just necessary. And sometimes in war, necessary was the best you could hope for. Frank Merritt returned to the United States in August 1945. He was discharged from the Army Medical Corps with the rank of captain and a service medal. No Purple Heart, no Bronze Star, nothing that marked him as remarkable. Just another medical officer who'd done his duty. He enrolled in graduate studies at Cornell University, focusing on clinical nutrition. His dissertation expanded on the work at Fulda, using the camp data as a foundation for broader research on metabolic recovery from starvation. It was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 1947, cited primarily by other academics working on similar problems. The military continued using his protocols. During the Korean War, medical units treating liberated POWs followed the guidelines in feeding and rehabilitation of prisoners of war, the manual that incorporated Merritt's Fulda report. Casualties from refeeding syndrome dropped significantly. Lives were saved by lessons learned in a converted Luftwaffe base that most people never heard of. Merritt himself moved into private practice in upstate New York, specializing in pediatric nutrition. He worked with children suffering from malnutrition, eating disorders, metabolic diseases. He published occasionally, taught part-time at Syracuse University, and lived a quiet life that bore no obvious connection to the war. He never spoke publicly about Fulda. When colleagues asked about his military service, he'd say he'd been a field hospital doctor, nothing special. The one time a former patient tracked him down, a man who'd been liberated from a German camp and remembered being treated by an American doctor who'd saved his life with careful feeding, Merritt simply said, "I'm glad you recovered. That's what mattered." Decades later, when the Fulda files were declassified, researchers discovered something sobering. Of the 1,147 prisoners repatriated to the Soviet Union, at least 200 were re-imprisoned upon arrival. 68 disappeared entirely. The NKVD files, when they finally opened after the Cold War, showed that many had been charged with collaboration, sentenced to years in Gulag camps, or executed as traitors. The American medical reports were among the few neutral documents that survived. Merritt's careful clinical notes about weight gain and caloric intake became historical evidence of a brief moment when liberated prisoners had been treated with something approaching care, before politics and paranoia reclaimed them. In 1989, a Soviet émigré researcher named Yuri Petrov published a book about Soviet prisoners in Western custody. He included a chapter on Fulda, based on declassified records and interviews with survivors. Petrov noted that despite the ultimate fate of many prisoners, their time in American custody had been, for most, the first period of relative safety they'd experienced in years. He quoted one survivor, identified only as Sergeant M., who'd said, "The American doctor, I do not remember his name, he taught us we could eat again. Not just take food, but ask for it. In that camp, for 3 weeks, we were human again. Then we went home and became suspects. But those 3 weeks, I remember them." Merritt died in 1994, at the age of 78. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his contributions to pediatric nutrition and his service in World War II. It said nothing about refeeding syndrome, nothing about Fulda, nothing about the protocols that had become standard practice. But in medical libraries and military archives, his report remained. A dry, technical document full of charts and recommendations. A manual written in blood pressure readings and weight measurements. A quiet answer to a question that keeps recurring whenever wars end and survivors emerge. How do you help people who've forgotten what safety means? The answer Merritt found was simple, even if applying it wasn't. You start slowly. You measure carefully. You respect that healing can be as dangerous as harm. You let them ask for more when they're ready. And you accept that sometimes keeping people alive is all you can do. The rest is beyond your control. At Fulda, in the spring of 1945, that was enough. 23 men collapsed from abundance. More than 1,000 survived to face whatever came next. The numbers mattered, but so did the gesture. The act of being allowed to ask for seconds, the possibility of eating without fear. In the end, it wasn't the food that saved them. It was the gradual realization that they could want food without punishment, that appetite could be acknowledged, that hunger, for a brief moment, was something to be addressed rather than hidden. Merritt never claimed to have rescued anyone. He just fed them carefully and sent them on. But in the arithmetic of war, where most stories end in nothing but loss, that counted as something close to victory. Not the kind that gets monuments, just the kind that lets people survive long enough to remember they're human. And sometimes, in the aftermath of catastrophe, that's the only victory available.